Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Halley, and thanks for being with us. So, in case you don't subscribe, we publish a weekly newsletter called Hall Pass. It delves into all things education and is one of the many different education center products we produce here at Ballotpedia. Well, today I'm joined by our Director of Content Strategy, Josh Altick, for a deep dive into one of the most exciting policy areas that we're exploring and documenting this year: rural school choice. 15 states have universal private school choice as of March 2025. This enables citizens anywhere in their state to take advantage of their various programs and policies. Universal school choice programs provide public funds for alternatives to public schools, such as private schools, charter schools, and homeschooling, and are designed so that all students can be eligible, regardless of family income, location, demographic, or disability. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, or NSCES for short, and the census, 45% of school districts across the United States are classified as rural. It's actually more than 13,000 school districts in the country with nearly 90,000 elected school board members. It's nearly a fifth of all elected officials in the country. So school boards really do dominate American politics. Now, these school districts are represented by legislators from just under about 3,000 different state legislative districts. And with state legislatures around the country increasingly forging their own paths when it comes to policy, education is naturally a pretty big priority. So let's get caught up on the policy debate this year. Josh, thanks for coming on the show. Good to see you.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
Yeah, well, we both have young kids, so education's front and center both in our mind and probably many of our listeners' minds. So let's dig a little deeper into universal school choice and rural school choice. You gave a little explanation in the introduction, but uh, tell us listeners kind of a little more about exactly what's the difference between rural and suburban or urban areas and school choice and that debate and how that all plays out.
Sure. Yeah. So this debate right now is relevant, especially in Republican controlled states, because the debate is focused on other aspects of the policy in the Democratic states and the divided states. But it is a concept that applies across the country. If you imagine trying to send your child to school in a rural school district, there might just be one, maybe two schools, and there may or may not be a lot of private school options. So you have fewer options, and people travel farther to get to the same school. Contrast that with an urban area where you have dozens of schools all in the same area, all within driving distance of any neighborhood. So the landscape is very different in rural areas than it is in urban areas. And right now, especially the red states are trying to navigate how to design programs that serve both areas, both types of area. And so that's where this debate is really coming down to the wire in especially in Republican states right now.
Right. Okay. So let's dig into that. So legislators representing rural areas are concerned about what is they're concerned that the state funding for private schools will just be of no benefit to rural families, or do they see the private school policy choices as harmful in some way, or what is that really?
Yeah, it's really both. Their concerns are on both extremes. Maybe the policies provide no benefit in the rural areas because there are no options to take advantage of that funding, in which case the rural residents are subsidizing policies that only help urban and suburban families. But if, on the other hand, the programs are widely used, will there be a detrimental decline in attendance for the public schools? The public school that might be the biggest employer in the area or serve as sort of a community gathering place, a really important aspect of the community in this more sprawling population. Proponents, of course, argue that the reality will be and has been so far somewhere in the middle, that there are opportunities for rural families to benefit from school choice. And maybe those look a little bit different or they have to be a little more creative, but they're there. And that public schools in rural areas really remain well attended and could even benefit overall from kind of an injection of potential competition. So those are the two perspectives that are really at play here: the two extremes and the two negative possibilities, and then the argument that really what's going to happen is somewhere in the middle.
Gotcha, and we've got all sorts of content on Ballotpedia, exploring all of this, and, just to take a quick tangent aside, because we'll talk a heck of a lot more in the rest of the episode, but if listeners decided, "I'm interested, I wanna go read about this," how do they go read about this on ballotpedia.org?
Right, yeah, so we have a brand new page that I'm very proud of, calling it a portal page, where you can really enter into this policy topic and dive really in any direction you want. You can drill down into, studies, into arguments, into possible reforms, into the status quo, what the current policies are. So if you go searching on Ballotpedia for a page called, "The Impact of School Choice on Rural School Districts," it really allows you an entry point to how we're approaching this policy topic in our information.
Yeah, and we'll get that link in show notes as well. Okay, so now let's get back on topic. So, what are we seeing in terms of legislative activity? Are we seeing a lot of bills in the pipeline on school choice so far this session? What's that looking like?
Yeah, not only in the pipeline, they've already moved through the pipeline in a lot in a couple states. So, Wyoming just passed a universal education savings account bill this last week,
Okay.
expanding their previous program. Tennessee approved a universal program earlier this year, and I'd also keep an eye on Texas. School choice was essentially the formative issue in last year's Republican primary in Texas. And, following the 2024 election, the legislature looks poised to have the votes to pass a school choice policy, and it likely will be a universal one, meaning the state goes straight from really no private school choice program to having a universally eligible private school choice program. Right now, the House and the Senate are kind of ironing out different versions and trying to come to a consensus on what exactly they want that program to look like, but I would keep an eye on Texas as well.
Okay. So you mentioned education savings accounts and different types of school choice programs that are out there. So, what are some of the differences between the most common that listeners would recognize and understand?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's important to sort of restate that what we're talking about here really is school choice as it relates to alternatives to public school. And there's a whole arena of policy around creating choice or limitations within the public school arena. So whether that's open enrollment or charter schools or magnet schools, and that's really an entire branch of the policy that we also explore. But right now we're talking about, if you want an alternative to the public school system, where can you go and how can you fund that? So we're talking about how states pass policies that really allocate state funds to education options that are alternatives to public school. And the most common of those certainly would be a private school. But there are other options as well. Homeschooling, micro schools are kind of on the up and up. But really, you can talk about this in three big buckets. We'll start with education savings accounts. I mentioned those in Wyoming. That I would say is sort of the current in style policy. Lots of activity in that bucket. 8 Republican states have enacted universal ESA programs since 2021. And if you're talking about school choice right now in 2025, you're probably talking about some version of an education savings account. The other 2 buckets are still in play, though. There's policies on the books right now and proposals constantly in these areas as well. So that would be vouchers. And the difference between an education savings account and a voucher is a little nuanced. In fact, oftentimes they are conflated, just in used one term. But we define the difference as being an ESA goes to the the families or the parents, and they decide where the funds are spent, while a voucher goes directly to the school that the student is attending. So that's really how we define the difference between those 2 types of programs. And then the third is the bucket that kind of comes down in tax credits and deductions. So you can create a refundable tax credit, and provide funding for education-related expenses through that credit. And sometimes these kind of get mixed and matched and blended together, but for the most part, you can understand the policy distinctions in those 3 buckets and then narrow it down from there.
And just for a point of clarification on ESAs, are those always before the money is spent, or do you sometimes have ESAs serve the form of reimbursement? So, for instance, if you're in a state which has ESAs, do families receive that money before they've even essentially spent it and sent it off to schools? Or is it the case where in some states you have to spend your money first, then you can file for a reimbursement from the state.
It really does vary. Yeah, you can do any combination you want. In fact, one of the reform proposals or options, one of your menu options here that's being proposed a lot, and I think was in one of the recent programs passed, is to give the money up front for families that are underneath a certain income threshold, but provide it as a reimbursement for families that are above that threshold. So even in the
Mm,
same state, you might see a system that uses two different timelines depending on income or situation. So
yeah.
yeah, a lot of variety there, even within the same program, depending on different criteria.
So the whole education reform space is, has evolved a lot over the years. One thing we talked about in the show earlier this year is the United States federal government's Department of Education has been around since 1980, and obviously that's in the news a lot right now. So education has always been front and center in some way. How long have these programs been around for? Is this a new and recent thing, or have they been around for a long time in states?
Yeah, so the concept of private school choice has certainly been around for a long time. Uh, we are right now the the policy flexion point is really on that keyword universal, um, meaning is this an option that's just available for disabled students, or are you going to start providing this and make everyone eligible? So talking about the history there, the first universal program was actually in Minnesota. It was Minnesota's education tax deduction in
Mm.
1955. So that's a good long time ago. Um, and since then, there's been a lot of, as you said, development and changes and evolution in that space. And education savings accounts really came on the scene. They kind of burst on the scene not that long ago, um, kind of replacing the idea of a voucher with the idea of an ESA. And I would say that you know s- in the last 6 7 years, that's really been where the focus has gone. But the history of providing state funding for alternatives goes back to the 1950s.
Gotcha. And Minnesota probably a little more of a purplish state, we would say, since in state legislatures, it has vacillated between being a Democratic trifecta sometimes over the last decade or so and having some of the chambers controlled by Republicans, and or even this year having a split tied state house. So many of the states are Republican trifectas that have universal school choice programs, which you've been alluding to. Now, there are 11 Republican trifectas, at least at the start of this year, that don't have the same policies. So, what's the story and trend there? Does it seem like they're all sort of moving and marching in this direction, or is there kind of a split ongoing within the Republican Party about this policy area?
Right, yeah, and so, there are with Idaho passing, their program, there are now only 3 states, 3 Republican states that don't have really an established private school choice program of some type. Um, so what are those, remaining, I guess, 8 states? What's the deal with those? And what they have is a limited program. So it might be limited so that it's available to students with disabilities. It might be
Hmm.
available to students with families having a lower income. So those programs still exist, and oftentimes there will be a state that has multiple school choice programs. One designed for disabled students, one designed based on income, one designed for eligibility that across the entire spectrum. So those programs aren't really going away. In some cases, they're being updated or amended. And the debate, I think, really is around the priorities of the state and this idea, getting back to rural school districts, this idea of rural areas and um, trying to understand how a one size fits all aspect of this works versus trying to customize it for individual and varying areas of the state and varying demographics. So it's really about balancing that concept. How much can a statewide program do, and how varied does it have to be? What criteria does it have to take into consideration? And that's where a lot of the debate comes down to this question of serving both rural and urban areas. And that's, I think, been a sticking point for a policy topic that has kind of a general support in the party platform. It's a If you look at the Republican Party platform, there's a lot of support for school choice programs. And so then I think this idea of representing and serving the needs of those rural constituents and understanding this assumption that school choice doesn't help them, and whether that's accurate or not, or the ability to design a program that does help them is really the sticking point in those 11 states, I would say.
So, what sort of evidence and sort of case studies or examinations have been done that legislators are looking at? I know you're kind of alluding to some of that as the years go by, more and more data accumulates. Um, are there any states that have had some case studies, and what have we learned from those so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we're actually working on right now, which I don't think has been done enough, and that we're excited about, is actually diving into that question of what is the flexion point of this debate. So that's not actually looking at the performance of the programs or anything. That's answering the question of, well, do is it because of rural constituents and representing those constituents that there are Republican legislators that vote against school choice? As we saw happen in Texas over the saga from 2023 to now, you had Republicans in the House who did not support sort of the party line in favor of school choice, and Governor Abbott really took that spent a lot of time in 2024 challenging those Republicans in primaries, and it
Yeah.
became the focal point of the election. But is that true across the country? Is that true in the other 10 states? So we're really diving into that and doing analysis on voting patterns and the history of legislative voting history on school choice bills back for a decade, and really answering that question, trying to decide, is this really as important of an issue and a debate point as it seems to be. So
Yeah, we
that's
saw the
one end.
same thing in Tennessee last year as well in their primaries. So, um, it's a pretty common topic that does come up within Republican primaries. So, we spent a lot of time in this episode talking about the Republican states and what they're doing here and their activities in this in education policy. What are some of the policies that are coming forth within Democratic states? And that's probably a whole nother episode to get into that. But there are more Republican trifectas than Democratic trifectas right now. More state legislatures controlled by Republican majorities. But what are the Democratic states doing? What kind of priorities do they put forth with respect to both education and, in particular, if anything, rural education?
Right, yeah. I think in Democratic states and states with Democratic control and in one chamber or elsewhere, the the debate is centered more on what's best for the public school programs. And that's where a lot of the studies you were talking about the actual performance of the programs and how they affect education are really playing out in places like Arizona and Florida that have had robust programs going for quite some time. We're starting to get some answers to the question of, well, how does this affect public schools? How much do these programs cost over time? How much participation will there be? And the concern is, I think on the Democratic side and also among Republicans, is that there will be some harm to public schools. If funding follows students and students leave public schools, then that funding leaves. If states prioritize funding for these private school choice programs, does that mean they're deprioritizing public school funding? Those are the questions that are being answered right now, and the questions that are being asked in all the states that are talking about school choice programs. And I think in the Democratic states, there's just a much stronger air on the side of public school health and the status quo than there is on the Republican side. The idea of prioritizing parental involvement and parental options, trying to get competition going, maybe underlying it all, there might be an attitude about public school and public education and the evaluation of how it's doing, because that really fuels the debate as well. If you have a really positive feeling about how public education is going, then considering the risk of possibly changing that status quo is a really unappealing idea. While if you have a lot of concerns about how public education is going, trying to shake things up is much more appealing right off the bat.
Yeah, education is always front and center in our public policy debates, and in particular with the post-COVID world and the post-COVID reading scores and math scores and sort of the national attention that those are getting.
Right.
It's certainly not a topic that state legislatures are shying away from. So, what else can we give our listeners a heads up for as a preview of what kind of coverage we have to come later this year, Josh?
Yeah, so we've already done a lot of work aggregating polling, so trying to figure out what the public polling is on this issue, aggregating arguments. What are the core arguments, sort of on one side and the other of this debate, and then what are the different policy proposals? So we're really diving into the details of these programs and kind of pulling out the ideas, the policy innovation that's happening. So we saw in some of Texas's provisions that one of the things you could do to make this more appealing is um, make the children of state elected officials ineligible for the program. So then it doesn't feel like you're just directing funds back to
Mm,
elected officials. That's maybe
right.
a small thing in terms of the budget for these programs, but it's in there. I'm already mentioned the idea of when do you distribute the funds? Well, you can make that contingent on all kinds of criteria, like income thresholds. Um, and then there's the question of prioritization. So even though all students are eligible in a universal program, if you have a capped budget, then which students do you give priority to? And you could prioritize based on lots of criteria. So one of them being where they go to school now, another one being income, that sort of thing. So we're really diving into the details and presenting sort of the full menu of policy proposals that are available to the policymakers trying to go out there and design these bills that work for their states. And that's all on the site, and we're improving it constantly. Really, what's coming up next, I think I'm excited for our big analysis of legislative voting history and how that
Yeah.
correlates to representation across the country and whether your constituents are rural or largely urban. And then a lot of content, a lot of stories, a lot of trying to aggregate and curate real stories of real people with real experiences in these scenarios and trying to match that up with and line that up with all the data and analysis we're doing.
There's going to be a lot more states still in session for the next few months, so there will be a lot to follow. Josh, it's great to see you and great to have you on the show today.
Absolutely. Hopefully, we'll have another one of these later on in the year.
You bet. We'll make that happen. And for our listeners, you can learn more about our school choice coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Powley, and thanks for listening.